Duke of Wexford hired the thin, quiet young manservant on a wet October morning, and it was nearly a year before he understood that he had, without knowing it, taken a fugitive gentlewoman into his household and slowly fallen in love with her. The young man gave his name as Kit Fenwick. He was slight and pale, with a soft, unbroken voice he apologized for as a lingering effect of a childhood fever, and large, careful gray eyes, and hands too fine and too clever for the rough work he sought. He asked for any place at all, boot boy, under footman, anything with a roof and a locked door of his own. He had no references. He had, the Duke saw plainly, run from something. But there was a straight-back dignity in the boy, an educated turn to his speech that he could not quite hide, and a desperation under the composure that moved the Duke of Wexford more than he let show. The Duke had known desperation. He gave the boy a place as his own under-valet, and a small room with a lock on the door, and asked no questions, because he had learned in his own life that the people most worth helping are often the ones least able to explain themselves. He would learn, much later, the whole of what Kit Fenwick was running from. That Kit was Catherine Fenwick, a gentleman's daughter left penniless and orphaned at 20, made the ward of an uncle, who meant to marry her against her will to a brutal old creditor to settle the family's debts with her body. That she had cut off her hair one midnight and stolen a dead brother's clothes, and walked out of that house into the dark rather than be sold. That a young woman alone on the roads was prey, but a young manservant seeking work was merely poor, and so she had become Kit, and hidden herself inside a boy's coat and a boy's name and a lowered voice, and sought the one thing that could keep her safe, an honest place in a respectable house, with a door she could lock, where no one would think to look for a runaway heiress among the menservants. She had chosen the Duke of Wexford's household precisely because it was known to be a serious, quiet, well-run house, its master a grave widower who kept no wild company and asked little of anyone. She had meant to be invisible. She had meant to stay a year, save her wages, and slip away to somewhere her uncle's reach could not follow. She had not meant to be seen, and the Duke of Wexford, though it took him the better part of that year, saw her. It came in pieces, the seeing, and each piece he explained away. He noticed first that his under-valet was extraordinarily learned for a servant. Kit could read Latin. The Duke caught him once mouthing the words of a book left open on the library table, and the words were Virgil, and the boy's lips shaped them correctly. He noticed that Kit set a table and arranged a room with an instinct no boot boy is born with, the instinct of someone who had grown up in a house where such things were done well, and had watched and knew. He noticed that Kit flinched from other men's roughness and rough talk, with a fastidiousness that the other servants mocked as missish. He noticed that the boy never removed his coat, never rolled his sleeves, never bathed but behind a firmly locked door, kept himself apart with a wariness far beyond ordinary shyness. Each thing, alone, the Duke explained. A fallen gentleman's son, no doubt, ashamed of some ruin, guarding some private grief. He was fond of the boy, protective of him, in a way he did not examine. And fondness makes a man incurious about the things he does not wish to disturb. But there were things fondness could not explain forever. There was an incident that winter that ought to have told him everything, and instead only deepened the fondness he would not examine. The head groom, a big coarse man named Barrow, had taken a dislike to the new under-valet from the first, despised the soft voice, and the fine hands, and the fastidious ways, called Kit the young lady in the servants' hall to raise a laugh, and made 100 small brutish sports of him. Kit bore it with a rigid silence that only egged the man on. And one bitter night Barrow, in drink, cornered the boy in the stable passage, and seized him by the collar, and swore he'd find out what the little missish creature was hiding under all that buttoning up, and had got one rough hand into the front of Kit's coat before the boy tore free, with a strength born of pure terror, and fled. The Duke of Wexford heard of it within the hour. Kit would not tell him, but another servant did, and the cold fury that rose in him was, he told himself afterward, no more than any master owed a helpless dependent. He had Barrow turned out of the house that same night, in the snow, without a character, and he did it with a controlled ferocity that silenced the whole servants' hall, and he made it known, plainly, that any man who laid a hand on Kit Fenwick again would answer to him personally and leave Wexford ruined. He did not ask himself why the thought of that big hand at the boy's collar had made him want to do the man violence. He did not ask himself why he went, afterward, to the boy's little locked room and stood outside the door and asked, low, whether Kit was hurt, whether Kit was safe, whether Kit wanted anything at all, and felt his chest ease only when the soft voice answered, shaken but whole, from the other side of the door, that Kit was safe, thanks to his grace, and would never forget it. He told himself it was a master's duty. It was not a master's duty. It was the thing his heart already knew, and his mind would not yet let him hear. And on the far side of that locked door, Catherine Fenwick pressed her back against the wood and wept with relief, and with something more bewildering than relief. Because a man had just made himself, without being asked, and without knowing what she was, a wall between her and harm, and no one had done that for her since her father died, and she did not know what to do with a safety she had not had to buy or fight for herself. He came to understand, over the months, that he looked forward to the boy's presence in a way he had not looked forward to anything since his wife died. Kit attended him mornings and evenings, laid out his clothes, tended his boots, and increasingly stayed to talk, because the Duke had discovered that his quiet under-valet had a mind, and a dry, careful wit, and opinions about the books in the library that were better than his own. The Duke of Wexford was a lonely man. He had told himself for years that he preferred solitude. And here was this slight learned boy who could discuss Virgil and estate accounts and the follies of the neighboring gentry with equal ease, and the hour of dressing and the hour of undressing had become, without his quite noticing, the 2 hours of his day he did not wish to end. He remembered afterward one evening in particular, deep in that year, that he ought to have understood and did not. It was a night he could not sleep, troubled by a hard matter of the estate, a dispute over a drainage right that turned on an old and tangled deed, and Kit, laying out his things, had glanced at the papers spread across the desk, and, with a diffidence that could not quite hide the sharpness underneath, offered an observation. The boy had, it emerged, read the deed while tidying, had noticed a clause the Duke's own lawyers had passed over, had reasoned out, in 3 quiet sentences, the very argument that would win the case. The Duke of Wexford had stared at his under-valet across the candlelit study, and felt the ground shift a little under him. For this was not the cleverness of a quick servant. This was the trained legal mind of someone who had been taught to read a document the way gentlemen's children are taught, and taught well. "Where did you learn to read a deed like that?" he had asked, and watched the boy go still and wary, and had seen the answer arrive too late to be called back. "My father taught me, your grace." He set great store by his daughters being, and there Kit had stopped, white, the word daughters hanging in the air like a struck bell, and had stammered something about a household of book learning and fled the room on an invented errand. The Duke had let it go. He had told himself the boy misspoke, meant sisters, meant anything. But he had sat late over the fire that night, more disturbed than the drainage right could account for, turning over the pull he felt toward this strange learned creature under his roof. And he had thought, with a flush of shame he did not understand, that he had never in his life so looked forward to being dressed and undressed by a valet, never so contrived to keep a servant talking, never felt the particular warmth that spread through him when the soft voice ventured an opinion and turned out to be right. He was an honorable man, and he could make no sense of himself, and it frightened him, and he had gone to bed at last no wiser, and had lain awake a long time listening to the wind and thinking of gray eyes. He understood it all, later, that the word had not been a slip, but the truth trying to get out, that his heart, quicker and honester than his frightened mind, had simply recognized a woman of rare quality and begun, quietly and against all the evidence of a boy's coat, to love her. But that night he had only known that a plain under-valet had solved a problem his lawyers could not, and that the hours he spent in that quiet, learned company had become the part of his day he lived toward, and that something in it all did not add up, and he had chosen, out of fondness and fear together, not to do the sum. He was troubled by it. He was an honorable man, and he found himself uncommonly, inexplicably drawn to the company of a young manservant, and it disturbed him deeply because he did not understand it, and it did not fit anything he knew of himself. He watched Kit across the library of an evening. The fine, clever hands, the gray eyes, the soft voice, the straight, dignified back, and felt a pull he had no name for and no right to, and told himself he was merely lonely, merely fond, merely grateful for good conversation. He did not let himself look too closely at the pull. He was afraid of what it might mean about him. And then, on a night in the following autumn, he learned what it meant. It was late, and a storm had come up, and the Duke had been reading by the fire when he heard, from the passage, a sound that did not belong, a low, muffled sound of weeping. He went out with a candle and followed it, and found the door to the small still room ajar, and inside, believing herself entirely alone in the sleeping house, was Kit. Kit, who had received that afternoon a letter that had found its way to the house at last, a letter from the one old servant of her father's she trusted, warning her that the uncle had traced her as far as the county and was making inquiries, that she was not safe, that she must run again. And Kit, cornered and exhausted and certain the year of hard-won safety was about to collapse into flight and danger once more, had broken at last, alone in the dark still room in the middle of the night, and had, in her grief, forgotten herself entirely, had unwound the tight binding beneath the shirt to breathe, had let down the little that had grown back of the shorn hair, and was weeping, in the candlelight, unmistakably and entirely a woman. The Duke of Wexford stood frozen in the doorway, and in the space of one held breath, a year of things that had not made sense all at once. The learning, the fine hands, the locked door, the fastidiousness, the soft, unbroken voice, and his own heart turned over in his chest, the pull he had felt and feared and could not name, the disturbing draw toward a slight learned boy, the 2 hours of the day he could not bear to end. It had never been the wrong thing he had feared it was. It had been the most natural thing in the world. He had been falling in love, month by month, with a woman. He had only been prevented from knowing it by a boy's coat and a stolen name. Kit, Catherine, saw him in the doorway, and the blood went out of her face, and she snatched at the shirt and the composure and the whole ruined disguise, and stood, trembling, cornered, a year of desperate safety shattering around her, and said, in a voice that was suddenly and helplessly her own, a woman's voice, low and frightened and pleading, "Your Grace, I can explain. Please, I beg you, do not turn me out into the dark tonight. Only tonight, and I will be gone by morning. I swear it. Only do not send me out into the storm where he can." She stopped, hearing how much she had betrayed in a breath. She pressed her fine hand over her mouth. He, the Duke of Wexford repeated, very quietly, not moving from the doorway, giving her all the room in the world. "Someone is hunting you." It was not a question. It was the first thing he thought to say, because in the instant of understanding everything, the thing that rose in him above the shock, above even the overturning of his own heart, was a cold, clean fury on her behalf, at whoever had driven a gentlewoman to cut off her hair and hide inside a boy's coat in fear of the dark. "Sit down," he said gently. "You are not going out into any storm tonight, nor any other night for anyone. Sit down and be easy, and tell me, from the beginning, who you are, and who has frightened you so badly that you have lived a year in my house afraid to take off your coat, and then we will decide together what is to be done. But no one is putting you out into the dark, not while I draw breath. You have my word as your master, and—" he hesitated, and then said it, because it was suddenly and overwhelmingly true, "and as a man who has, it seems, spent the better part of a year growing to love you, without the first idea that that was what he was doing." She told him, that night, sitting by the still-room fire with the storm at the windows, told him the whole of it, in her own voice at last, the voice she had swallowed for a year. Her father's death, the debts, the uncle who had made himself her guardian, and then made a bargain of her, the brutal old creditor who was to have had her in payment, the midnight when she had cut off her hair and stolen her dead brother's clothes, and walked out rather than be sold. She told it plainly, without weeping now, because the relief of telling it to someone at last was greater than the fear. And the Duke of Wexford listened without once interrupting, his face growing grimmer and gentler by turns. And when she had finished, he was silent a long moment, and then he said only, "Catherine," trying her true name, and she flinched to hear it spoken aloud after a year, and then steadied, because he said it with such care. "Catherine," he said again, "you will not run again. I forbid it, not as your master. I have no more claim to be that. The fiction is over. But I forbid it as a man asking you to let him stand between you and the thing that has hunted you. Your uncle has no legal power to force a marriage upon you. That is not law. It is only cruelty, dressed as authority, and cruelty backed by debts and threats, and a frightened girl's isolation. But you are not isolated now. You are in the house of a duke, and a duke's roof, and a duke's lawyers, and a duke's plain refusal are a wall your uncle cannot climb. Let me be that wall. Stay. Not as Kit. That is finished. The coat comes off tonight and for good. But as my guest, openly, under my protection and my aunt's chaperonage, a gentlewoman in the house where she belongs. And let your uncle come, if he dares, and find you standing behind a duke, and let him try his threats on me." "You would do that," Catherine said, unbelieving, "for a servant who lied to you for a year, who came into your house under a false name and a false everything." "You did not lie," the Duke said. "You hid. There is a difference, and it is the whole difference. A liar deceives to take something. You disguised yourself to keep from being taken. You wronged no one under my roof. You only survived by the one road left open to a woman with no protector, and you did it with more courage than any man I know. I am not angry that you were not what you seemed. I am ashamed that the world is so arranged that you had to be anything but what you are." He leaned forward. "And I will tell you the thing I have only just understood, and you may do with it what you like. This past year I have been troubled, deeply troubled, by how much I looked forward to your company. A plain young manservant, I thought, and I could not understand the pull of it, and it frightened me, because I did not know what it meant about me. Now I know exactly what it meant. It meant I had met a woman of rare mind and rare courage and rare grace, and my heart knew it long before my eyes were allowed to. I fell in love with who you are, Catherine, with the wit and the learning and the straight brave back, through a coat that hid everything a man usually falls in love with first. Which means, I think, that what I feel rests on the truest possible foundation. For I loved the person before I ever knew the face was a woman's. That is not a thing many men can say of their love. I can. The first days out of the coat were the strangest of Catherine's life. The Duke's aunt was sent for at once. A shrewd, kindly old woman who arrived, was told the whole story in an afternoon, and pronounced it the most romantic and most scandalous thing she had heard in 40 years, and threw herself into the business of it with delight. She dressed Catherine again as a gentlewoman, found her gowns, restored to her 100 small forgotten comforts of womanhood, and installed herself as chaperone, with the frank remark that if her nephew was going to fall in love with his under-valet, he might at least do the thing respectably. And Catherine, who had spent a year swallowing her own voice, and hiding her own hands, and flinching from her own reflection, had to learn, day by strange day, to be Catherine again, to speak at her own natural pitch, to let her hands be seen, to sit in a drawing room as a lady and not stand in the corner as a servant, to be looked at instead of overlooked. The Duke watched the transformation with a wonder he did not try to hide. He had known the mind and the courage and the wit for a year, through the coat. Now he watched the rest of her come out of hiding, the grace of her, the low music of her true voice, the way she filled a room she had spent a year trying to be invisible in. And he fell in love all over again, with each thing as it emerged, and told her so, plainly, every day, because she had lived a year believing herself a thing to be hidden, and he meant to unteach her that belief, if it took him the rest of his life. "It is very strange," Catherine confessed to him one evening, in the library where Kit had once mouthed Virgil over a stolen book, "to be seen. I made myself unseeable for a year. I got so good at it that I half forgot there was anything under the coat worth seeing. And now you look at me all the time, as though I were She stopped, coloring. As though you were the most remarkable person I have ever had the fortune to hire by accident on a wet morning, the Duke finished. Because you are. You spent a year making yourself invisible, Catherine, and you were the most vivid thing in this house the whole time. I simply did not have the eyes to know why. I have the eyes now, and I intend to use them on you, gratefully, for the rest of my life. You need never hide again. That is what marrying me will mean. More than the title or the safety or any of it. It will mean you are done hiding, forever, and seen, forever, by a man who is very glad of the view. The uncle came, as the Duke had known he would. He came within the fortnight, having traced her at last to Wexford, and he came blustering and confident, a heavy, florid man with a creditor's ledger, where his conscience should have been, expecting to find a runaway girl he could frighten back into obedience, expecting, at worst, to buy the silence of whatever household had taken her in. He was shown into the Duke of Wexford's great drawing room, and there he found not a frightened girl, but the Duke himself, grave and cold and immovable, and beside him the Duke's aunt, and beside her, a young gentlewoman, in a proper gown, with her hair grown a little, and her chin up, and no fear at all left in her grey eyes. Catherine, restored to herself, standing in a Duke's drawing room, under a Duke's protection, looking at the man who had tried to sell her. The uncle began to bluster. He spoke of his rights as guardian, of debts of honor, of a betrothal all but signed, of the scandal that would attach to a house harboring a runaway ward. He was, the Duke observed, a man entirely accustomed to getting his way by being the loudest and most shameless person in any room. The Duke of Wexford let him finish. Then he spoke, quietly, and the quiet was more terrible than any shouting. You have no rights as guardian that extend to selling your ward's person to settle your family's debts, the Duke said. That is not guardianship. That is trafficking, and there are magistrates in this county, friends of mine, all of them, who would be most interested to hear the particulars, which this lady has set down in full and signed, and which my lawyers hold in copy. You speak of scandal. Let us speak of scandal then, plainly. There is a scandal here, and it is entirely yours. The scandal of a gentleman who was left the guardianship of his orphaned niece, and who used it to try to sell her to a creditor to cover his own debts, and who drove her to flee her own home in a dead brother's clothes rather than submit. That is the story, sir. That is the true story, and it is written down and witnessed, and if you speak one word against this lady's honor anywhere in England, I will see that true story told in every drawing room and every courtroom that will have it, and I will ruin you as thoroughly and as publicly as you tried to ruin her. Now you will discharge your claim to her guardianship, in writing, before you leave this room. My lawyer is waiting in the next, and you will settle your own debts with your own person, as gentlemen are meant to, and you will never come within 30 miles of this lady again. Or you will leave here and find the whole county apprised, by nightfall, of exactly what manner of guardian you have been. Choose. The uncle chose. Bullies faced with a wall higher than themselves generally do. He signed away his guardianship in the next room with a shaking, furious hand, and he left Wexford in his hired carriage, a smaller and quieter man than he had come, and he never troubled Catherine Fenwick again, because a frightened girl alone had become a gentlewoman, standing behind a duke, and there is no bully alive who does not deflate when the wall he counted on being able to climb turns out to be a man who will not move. And when the carriage had gone down the drive and the drawing room was quiet, Catherine turned to the Duke of Wexford, and the composure she had held so straight through the whole terrible interview broke at last into something bright and overflowing, and she said, "A year. A year I lived in your house afraid, saving my wages to run again, certain that safety was a thing I would have to buy alone, in the dark, forever. And you gave it to me in an afternoon. You made yourself a wall between me and the thing I ran from, and you did not even ask me to be grateful. You asked me to stay." "I asked you to stay," the Duke agreed, "and I am asking still, not as a guest under my protection. That was only ever the first step, the making safe. I am asking you to stay as the mistress of this house, Catherine. I told you I loved the person before I knew the face. Now I know both, and I love both, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life at a breakfast table across from the finest mind and the bravest heart I have ever met, and to never again have to call you by any name but your own." He took her fine, clever hand, the hand he had watched for a year, and told himself he did not understand his fondness for. "Marry me. Let the whole coat and the whole disguise, and the whole long-hidden year be finished. Be seen. Be Catherine, out loud, for the rest of your life, and be my wife." She had walked out of one house at midnight to keep from being made a man's property. She had spent a year hidden inside a boy's coat, so that no one could own her. And now a man was offering her the one thing the disguise had been protecting all along. Not to be taken, but to be chosen. Not to be owned, but to be loved, freely, and in the open, and by her own true name. Catherine Fenwick, who had been so brave alone in the dark for so long, put her free hand over her mouth, and then took it away, and said, in her own clear voice, "Yes, yes," and out loud, and by my own name, and in the daylight, "Yes, with all my heart." They were married in the spring, and the Duke of Wexford stood at the altar and watched his bride come toward him down the aisle in a gown of pale silk, with her hair grown long again and shining, and her gray eyes bright and entirely unafraid. And he thought of the thin, pale boy who had come to his door on a wet October morning, asking for any place with a locked door of his own, running from the dark. And he marveled that his own heart had known the truth of her, a whole year before his eyes were permitted to, had loved the mind and the courage and the grace straight through the coat that hid all the rest. When the vicar asked for her name, she gave it whole and clear and glad. Catherine, her own name, out loud in a full church, the name she had hidden for a year for fear of being found, and the sound of it spoken freely, with no one hunting it, was the sweetest sound the Duke of Wexford had ever heard. He had hired a plain manservant on a wet morning, out of ordinary kindness. He had found, hidden inside the coat, the whole of the rest of his life.